Dilan Yashogis is the Minister of Justice and Security in the Netherlands. She previously worked as State Secretary for Economic Affairs and Climate Policy, and from 2017 to 2021, she was a member of the House of Representatives and party spokesman on a range of issues. Prior to that, she was a member of the Municipal Council of Amsterdam and an advisor to the mayor and the members of the Amsterdam Municipal Committee. So there's probably a Hague joke in there somewhere, but we'll skip it for now. Joining her on the panel will be Amos Giora, Professor of Law at the University of Utah, a Distinguished Fellow at the Consortium for Center of Research and Study on the Holocaust, Distinguished Fellow, International Center for Conflict Resolution at the University of Pittsburgh. He's published extensively in the US, including a book, and one of the reasons he's here today, Tolerating Intolerance, the Price of Protecting Extremism, which is about the Netherlands. Finally, we're joined by my colleague, Emily Harding, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow with the International Security Program. She joined CSIS from the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, where she was Deputy Staff Director. And while on the committee, she led the investigation into Russian interference in the 2016 elections. This comes after a long career in the federal government, including a stint at the National Security Council. So with that, let me turn things over to the minister. She will begin by making keynote remarks, and then we will go to our panel. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I was born in Ankara, Turkey. My parents, they fled the country after the military takeover in September 1980, and I was 3 at the time. My parents instilled in me the significance of what happened in 1980. On that day, the 12th of September, the notion of the rule of law ceased to exist. The military junta became legislative and executive power in one, which effectively meant it became the judicial power as well, because justice became the realm of the military courts. The end of the separation of powers, the breakdown of a budding constitutional state. For many people, those may sound like academic and abstract subjects. But for opponents of the military regime in Turkey, it meant that, overnight, their world had become cold, hard, and hostile. The junta had people arrested and dissolved parliament. Union activities and all forms of association were outlawed. In the months after the military coup, hundreds of thousands of people were rounded up, imprisoned, and tortured on the basis of arbitrary orders. Historians later concluded that, essentially, an entire generation was erased. It was a truly dark period in which fear, distrust, and arbitrariness reigned. Neighbors no longer trusted each other. Friends disappeared into prison, never to return. People lost their jobs and their livelihoods. My parents had always had a good life in Turkey. They could have stayed silent, but they chose to unite with others, to make their voices heard. They chose to fight for fundamental freedoms. At one point, they were in acute danger. They could have been arrested at any moment. The danger became so great that their only option was to flee. Friends, family, work. They were forced to leave behind everything the life they had built. So we finally ended up in the Netherlands, where my parents found safety and freedom, true freedom. The freedom to be yourself. The freedom to be yourself. The freedom to speak up. The freedom to live your life the way you choose. My parents taught me from an early age the value of the freedom we enjoyed in the Netherlands. The value of democratic principles such as freedom of expression, the value of science, the profound importance of equal rights for everyone, no matter how much or how little money you have, no matter who you know or where you were born. That That's for me democracy. That is the rule of law. That is freedom. To me, freedom is the most important thing in the world. So if democracy under the rule of law comes under pressure, I will stand up for it. And that is why I'm standing here today, ladies and gentlemen. Because the rule of law, and thus freedom, are under pressure. In my country, in Europe, in your country, and in other parts of the world. We have war in Europe and military tensions in Asia. Today, I'd like to tell you about developments in the Netherlands. But I also hope to learn more about developments here in the United States, because I find your country fascinating. I believe that for many years and in many ways, the future has emerged first in America. Often opportunities manifest themselves here first, and so do threats. So I hope to learn from your experience. And above all, I hope we can help each other strengthen our democracies. In a nutshell, I describe the current situation in the Netherlands as follows. I am concerned about a toxic mixture of direct attacks on the rule of law, creeping erosion of our freedoms, threats to our democratic system, and Dutch complacency in the face of those threats. The first direct attack on the Dutch constitutional state that I experienced in my adult life was the murder of Pim Fortuyn. Fortuyn was a maverick politician, outspoken, courageous, and at times breathtakingly politically incorrect. He contrasted starkly with the bland politicians we were used to. As a young woman, I was captivated by him. What I found most appealing was his fierce devotion to freedom of expression. But on May the 6th, 2002, he was silenced by a bullet fired by an environmental activist. As you'd expect, there was general outrage and almost unanimous condemnation. In November 2004, Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was shot and stabbed to death in the streets of Amsterdam. Van Gogh had at times been highly critical of Islamic culture. Like Fortuyn, he was a fearless champion of freedom of speech. And like Fortuyn, he was silenced forever. But this time, the killer was a Muslim extremist. And this time, reactions were more mixed. What followed was not a blunt and uncompromising reassertion of freedom of speech. Instead, the government started talking about reviving old laws against blasphemy. And in the wake of that debate, the justice minister at the time argued that if a majority voted for the introduction of Sharia law in the Dutch justice system, then it should be introduced. That is democracy, he explained. That was when I first felt the ground beneath my feet start to wobble. Professor Amos Giora was someone who gave expression to that unease I felt at that time. Because in his book, Tolerating Intolerance, The Price of Protecting Extremism, he spoke of a sacred veil that hung over religious matters in the Netherlands. The way I see it, Dutch politicians traditionally are so reluctant to talk about religious matters that they choose to ignore even religious extremism. And I am truly delighted that Professor Giora is here with us today and will be taking part in the panel discussion. Thank you again. And I hope also he will expand on this and other themes, of course. In the years since the murders of Fortuyn and Van Gogh, we've seen many other attacks on our democratic values and the rule of law. There have been many other instances of violent religious intolerance. According to the latest threat assessment by our intelligence services, supporters of jihadism remain the greatest terrorist threat to the Netherlands. On top of the jihadist threat, we've seen several other disturbing developments. The recent murders of a lawyer with a spotless reputation and of a crime reporter of national renown bear all the hallmarks of contract killings ordered by criminal drug gangs. As we speak, around 60% of all mayors in the Netherlands have received threats expressly intended to intimidate. Often, these threats relate to our fight against the drug gangs, which are trying to tighten their grip on Dutch society. Journalists, lawyers, public prosecutors, and other guardians of the rule of law now receive government protection, because without it, they would no longer be able to do their work. Now, of course, this is a major concern in itself. But what adds insult to injury, in my view, is the absence of public outrage in the face of all this. The reaction of the public establishment, as well as the general public, strikes me almost as unconcerned or apathetic. I believe there's a strong tendency in my country, in the Netherlands, to take the democratic rule of law for granted, as if it's something that has always been there and always will be, no matter what. And if there's no need to defend it or to nurture it. Part of the explanation is surely that the Netherlands is an old and generally stable democracy. For almost 80 years, generations of Dutch people have not experienced war, repression, or persecution. And as a result, the notion of a democracy in peril may become an alien concept. Vigilance against forces that subvert democracy may wane. A people may become too comfortable for its own good. And then complacency kicks in. And that's a terrible danger, in my view. I realize that a sudden military coup, like we saw in Turkey, is hardly likely in a modern democracy. But modern democracies, they face other dangers. Some are familiar, but others are new. And when mixed, they may react and form powerful new toxins. Let me take a step back here. I assume you're all familiar with the notion of the democratic paradox. I understand it this way. What if anti-democratic forces were to use the democratic system to bring that very system to an end and establish an autocracy? In other words, what if democracy were to commit suicide? Many countries, like Germany and Italy, have safeguards in their constitutions to prevent this phenomenon. Political parties that display anti-democratic tendencies can be banned. In the Netherlands, we have such provisions too. But they are very broadly formulated, and that might prove problematic. If they were invoked, the judiciary would likely be pulled into political controversy, putting the separation of powers in jeopardy. And that probably explains why this ban has almost never been imposed. But the need for a workable ban on political parties has been a matter of debate for a long time. First, the focus shifted from right-wing extremist parties to parties and movements of religious extremists. And lately, the main focus has shifted back again to parties on the extreme right. And the debate is intensifying rapidly. That's because the new dangers I mentioned are also manifesting themselves rapidly. And the engine driving them is the internet. And let me offer Professor Giora's definition on this technology. The internet is a limitless platform for information and data sharing. It is, in addition, however, a low-cost, high-speed dissemination mechanism that facilitates the spreading of hate speech, including violent and virtual threats. So, of course, in general, Dutch society has greatly benefited from internet. But too often, many of us feel we've become trapped inside one great, all-encompassing, hysterical algorithm. In recent years, we've seen it all. The last word in internet madness is, of course, the post-truth thought. In that way of thinking, there are no facts. Science is just an opinion at best, but more often a conspiracy. conspiracies that are attributed to governments, big business, the judiciary, the media, the World Economic Forum, etc. And in all the accusations and grievances, you hear ever more blatant overtones of anti-Semitism. One party leader in the Netherlands recently claimed that the world is run by giant lizards. This happened. I kid you not. Social media facilitates a complete alternative reality, which is increasingly incompatible with our real world. The world that does have laws and rules of social conduct. The CEOs of social media companies like Facebook and Twitter really need to step up their game. They must act to mitigate the effects of what they have created. I hope I've made it clear by now that the freedom of expression is very important to me. But that doesn't mean intimidation, incitement, and hate speech should have no consequences. For those who express them, those who spread them, and those who facilitate their dissemination. And the Dutch government is watching developments closely, and we are weighing our options. So the social-political dynamics in the Netherlands these days are such that in our latest terrorist threat assessment, our security services warn of people who are willing to use violence, causing mayhem and chaos, to ultimately overthrow the government and end democracy. In these people's view, they are simply accelerating the course that history is already taking, hence the term accelerationism. According to our security services, accelerationism is now the form of right-wing extremism that poses the greatest violent threat. A few hundred of these people have been identified, and some of them may pose a serious threat. So this is about young men, young boys, who want to establish a white ethno-state. And in the movement's online networks, a fascination with weapons has been observed. So we are closely monitoring which of them may be planning to swap their keyboards for guns. And when that time comes, we will make sure that the real world prevails over their parallel world. On a total different level, polarization is fueled by phenomena like woke ideology and cancel culture. And let me immediately first be quite clear. I am not talking here about the movements that are striving for inclusion and equal rights. Those are necessary forces aimed at openness and equality for benefit of all. And that is, in my opinion, very different from cancel culture. In my view, cancel culture is a force that seeks to exclude and stifle. And in those dynamics, the internet again plays a dubious role. The internet facilitates people who want to determine and dictate which opinion is correct and which is objectionable, what is hurtful and what is acceptable, what is wrong and what is right, who is wrong and who is right, who may speak and who should be silenced. In such a culture, certain topics, viewpoints, and opinions are declared out of order. Discussion is not the intention. And in any case, you're not allowed to participate unless you belong to the right group. This reduces individuals to their gender, origin, and orientation, with strictly prescribed opinions. As a result, the internet now makes it possible to punish people without the intervention of a court. Its users have become judge, jury, and executioner. From the woke corner, people are publicly and morally shamed, socially ostracized, and cancelled. And ironically, this often happens under the guise of inclusion. In addition to the major harm this inflicts on individuals, it also has perverse effects on our society as a whole. As I've mentioned, it has driven politicians, journalists to self-censorship, and that in itself is a disaster. And on top of that, some key sectors of society have proven incapable of dealing with this sort of pressure. I always regarded the worlds of art and culture, science and academia, as traditional sanctuaries for the free exchange of ideas. Yet it is precisely these sectors that seem to have fallen prey to these phenomena in the face of intellectual oppression. Take academia. More and more academics are being suspended or ostracized for not adhering to what are considered the right ideas. When students take offense at the curriculum is changed. When students demand safe spaces, university boards tend to comply. So much for learning to deal with new ideas. So much for open debate, which is the oxygen of a truly free society. So my final point is this. Sweeping accusations against entire population groups naturally have an effect on those population groups. Often, they will not speak out, but of course, they do have an opinion. And I sometimes wonder how often irritation about reproaches from Cancel Culture Corner drive moderate people towards the politicians I mentioned earlier. Politicians who've made dissatisfaction and radicalism their selling points, with further growth on the extremist fringe and social polarization as a result. So 3 months ago, I gave a lecture in the Netherlands addressing issues like these. My main objective was to create a sense of urgency, to alert people to the dangers I see. I urged them to stand up and protect our democracy. I urged them to behave like resilient democrats, to oppose extremism, dare to be intolerant of the intolerant, hold steady under pressure, and never compromise on principles of freedom and democracy. And in those last 3 months, however, the situation has been changing. Not as a result of my lecture, I'm sure. There were other, far more significant developments. In the Netherlands, radicalization on the far right fringe has become even more evident, with thinly veiled calls for violence against the state. 2 weeks ago, in the Dutch parliament, we witnessed the sudden emergence of a large majority for a ban on anti-democratic parties. Some even argued that such a law should be fast-tracked. I welcome the sense of urgency this conveys, but at the same time, I am wary of excessive haste, especially in this case. A new law, which makes it easier to ban parties, is a huge step that should be widely discussed, and if we decide on it, should also be prepared with the utmost care. There must never be a perception that such a law would be used to eliminate political rivals. The law must be formulated with such precision that judges can apply it in full transparency. It must be crystal clear, thus minimizing the risk that judges who apply it will be drawn into political debates. Another development that changed the situation took place here in the United States. The predominant analysis of the US midterm elections has been that many voters were guided by concerns about democracy. They put aside their deep and legitimate concerns about the economy and inflation, and even their ideological differences, because they were even more concerned about the foundations of democracy. And as I said earlier, I have a fascination with the United States. But there have been times in the last few years when I've been genuinely puzzled by what was happening here. Let me illustrate that with a final anecdote. Back in 2016, my husband and I spent our summer vacation in the Deep South. It was election time, and we invited ourselves to the local pizzeria where the Republicans had gathered. It was the final debate, I believe, between Clinton and Trump. Most of the people I met were Trump supporters. Initially, some were taken aback and perhaps even a little bit suspicious when I told them we were from Europe. Somebody said, "You Europeans think we are out of our minds, right?" But as always, in our experience, everybody quickly warmed up. They couldn't help but share the warmth and friendliness the South is famous for. And they quickly started talking our ears off. They told us all about what they were voting for and who they were voting for and why. And I must say, I was really struck by their reasoning. Of course, people had plenty to say about where the country was headed. But to my surprise, some also volunteered mixed feelings about their own candidate, and they expressed unconditional love for democracy. I remember one woman becoming emotional while we were discussing the situation in the Supreme Court. Democracy was in the balance, she stressed. And only with the right appointments could the Supreme Court tip that balance and save American democracy. And she added, the democracy in Europe and worldwide. Don't ask me to repeat her story in detail. It was hard to follow between the sobs, but I was genuinely impressed by her passion. I even felt a little jealous. In the Netherlands, I'd never seen such a display of passion for democracy and the rule of law. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the seed of this lecture was planned there by the impassioned Southern lady in 2016. And I intend to track her down again, because she got me thinking about the land of my earliest childhood, Turkey, about the importance of fundamental democratic values, about political developments in the United States, and about the state of democracy in my own country, my land of freedom, the Netherlands. She inspired me, and I like to tell her that. And of course, I'm very curious about who she voted for in 2020 and 21, or 22, I must say. I'd like to hear from her again what her motives were, because we need to listen. And then we need to learn and apply those lessons every day to further strengthen democracy and freedom. Thank you so much.
Well, that was a great speech. Thank you. It wasn't what I was expecting, but it was better. What we're going to do now is we'll have my two fellow panelists each make relatively brief remarks, and then we'll go into a discussion with them and the minister. So, Amos, let me start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for your warm comments about my book, which is what brought us together. There are three thoughts I'd like to share. One is 90 years ago, Goebbels said the following. We talked about this at dinner. That we, referring to the Nazis, are simply using the tools you idiots gave us. And I think that's something to keep in mind, because that was very much running through my mind when you were giving your talk. Are we, in essence, unaware of the threats to democracy? And are we willing, in the name of democracy, to tolerate intolerance from the other side? That's one. Two, there is a theory that was created by a European who came to the United States in the 30s, escaping the Holocaust before the Holocaust happened, which is called militant democracy. That's a theme that is largely unfamiliar to an American audience, but it very much is part of the European discussion today, which says the following. In order to protect democracy, there's a need to limit civil and human rights in order to protect ourselves from threats from within. For an American audience, it's very problematic because the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment go on and on and on. From a European perspective, in many ways, what you really are talking about or asking is to what extent should democracy, in order to protect itself, limit rights, thinking proactively rather than reactively, because we all know the consequences of thinking reactively. And my third thought, which is a very American thought, quoting the late Justice Brandeis, I think it was Brandeis or Cardozo, I never remember, who said, and I quote, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact." And taking that and superimposing it on your thoughts, I would suggest, before turning it over to you, that in many ways, whether it's the United States, the Netherlands, or Israel, where I commute between Jerusalem and Israel, democracy is under threat. That's the reality. And it's under threat not externally, but internally. And the question is, to what extent do we protect ourselves? And going back to the book that you graciously referenced, are we going to tolerate intolerance? Or are we going to say that intolerance so threatens us that we're going to draw a clear line in the sand, not a, one day here, one day there, but a clear line in the sand in order to protect democracy? Ma'am?
It's a lot to follow. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much to the minister for being here, and to you as well, Professor. It, I think, shows the strength and the richness of democracies that you traveled from Turkey and oppression to the Netherlands, where you built this amazingly successful life and are now such a prominent advocate for democracy and freedom. And you're moving back and forth between the US and Israel, two places that are deeply marked by the struggle for freedom. That freedom is our greatest strength here in the US and then also with our allies in Europe. It is the engine that creates innovation. It is the opportunity to go forth and explore and ask questions and make mistakes for sure, and then try to right those mistakes with the next election or with the next innovation or whatever debate provides. I think your story is a very personal example of that kind of democratic journey. On the other hand, your comment about Goebbels and using the tools you idiots gave us, I could hear that same echo perhaps in Moscow in 2016. We talked a lot when the Russians were attempting to undermine the structures of democracy here in the US about old wine in new bottles. They used the opportunity of social media, of this free exchange of ideas, to spread a lie around the world quicker than the truth could get its boots on. I love your line about we all feel like we're trapped in one great hysterical algorithm. That's a perfect explanation for the social media world that we live in today, because it does play on this element of human nature where what is sticky, what is impressive is what is shocking, and what is most compelling about social media are the things that surprise us and the things that are the most dramatic and in a lot of ways the most toxic. I also loved your comment about how the future has emerged in many ways in America, and I'm very proud of that as a proud American. Jim and I are both from small towns in the U.S., and it is wonderful to see the way that the U.S. does lead in a lot of ways. On the other hand, we're also behind sometimes too. In 2016, we were walking around shocked that mis and disinformation could have invaded this wonderful free exchange of ideas in the U.S., where I have these conversations with our European colleagues all the time. They kind of looked at us like, oh, that's so cute. We're going to pat you on the heads now. Like, we've been putting up with this for about a decade or more, and welcome to the party. We should have been listening at the same time we were brashly moving forward with our trademark American optimism. So I think that leaves us in an interesting position where there's a question of trust, don't trust. I talked to my kids and to their middle school classmates about how I want you to question things. In this crazy media environment that we live in, don't just take on face value what you read on whatever social media platform. Instead, I want you to ask, where did this come from? Is this a credible source? Does this person actually have evidence for what they're saying? I want you to question what you read. But at the same time, we need to find a way to rebuild trust in institutions. There's too much, I think, tearing down of the institutions that make democracies, and also of some of these impartial arbiters that do talk about truth as truth. Here at CSIS, we are very proud of our analytical independence. We say what we think, no matter who the donor may be, or no matter the question that we've been asked. We are a bipartisan institution, and we really value that impartial approach to the really difficult national security questions of the day. But I think Americans in particular have this real questioning of authority that's healthy until it spills over into trust no one, including your own government. So I would like, part of my job here at CSIS is to talk about my work in the intelligence community, my work in the national security sphere, and why it is, in large part, institutions you can trust, and how that feeds into a strong and vibrant democracy. So I think I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for your speech. It was wonderful and inspiring, and I hope you find her. I'm from the South myself, so I know these people. Yeah, I'll help you.
So this has always been an issue in democracies, and one of the things I think Europeans and others don't always realize is you have this cycle of populism in the US. We're in the third or fourth wave since the founding of the Republic, and sometimes they end badly, as in 1860, but usually the bus rights itself after some very amazing wobbles. what we depended on in the past, and this is where social media comes in, is what was called the marketplace of ideas. To give you an idea of the length of this debate, that's from the 1950s. But with social media, what you've really got is the flea market of ideas, right? The theory is that, well, you know, we would put these things out and there would be debate and we would arrive at the truth. It doesn't seem to be working, at least not at a rate equivalent to what can be promulgated on social media. So there's some real problems, and you've highlighted them in your speech. How do we balance control with freedom? I've talked to 2 of the 3 big social media companies. They're trying. I mean, they kind of woke up in 2016. It was a surprise to them. And at least 2 of them have changed their line that they think they now have a responsibility. But you're talking about platforms that have billions, I beg your pardon, billions of messages a day. There's no human way to manage that, right? And there's no technology that will manage it. So this is a problem. Let me start by asking all 3 panelists, given the length of this problem, given the rise of populism, both on right and left, I would say, what are the responsibilities for social media? What are the responsibilities of politicians for this debate? Minister, why don't I start with you?
Thank you so much. Then I will start with the last one, politicians, since I am one, so I should take responsibility here.
For all politicians?
Yes, of course, obviously. I got this. No. I think it's very important to, and for me it became very clear during the pandemic, where I remember at one point that a good friend of mine, she called me and she said, I'm looking on Facebook right now and I'm reading about a doctor who's saying there is no such thing as corona and this is just a conspiracy, this is fake, and I don't know what to believe anymore. And this is an educated woman, traveled the world, and she called me and she said, I really don't know because I think he's right, but I hear you saying something else. So I could, you know, I gave her phone numbers of doctors I knew, and I said, you have to then investigate for yourself. You have to, but know what's happening here online. You are being, you know, that algorithm has gotten you in the web. So get out of Facebook, leave online, and just go into the real world and talk to people. So she did that. And that was my moment that I thought it's very easy being in politics to say, okay, these are the crazy people, these are the weirdos, and I'm going to focus on the people who are, you know, who are listening to me and we have a good conversation and this is my audience, which is a huge mistake, I think. Absolutely. Because in times of insecurity, people will look for a story that will give them, you know, something to hold on to. And I realized that we, in politics, who were trying to tell what was happening without even knowing it exactly ourselves, we are very lousy storytellers. You know, you have someone who's not confined by rules, by laws, by facts. They're just telling a random story. And the best I did was come up with fact checks. That doesn't match. We don't have a good story. The story is about our democracy. What do we have here? What are we trying to do? Why can you trust our institutions? How can you trust them? Let's explain how this works. We didn't do all of that. We came up with fact-checking, and the storytellers who were trying to get those people in, they succeeded. So that was my lesson. So politicians should be always listening to people and to see what's happening really, and to go and find those people, and don't just disregard them by acting like, you know, you don't count because you're a weirdo. That's the biggest mistake you can make, and then the people who are trying to roll them in, they will succeed. So that's maybe one of my biggest lessons.
Maybe at the end we can talk about why anyone would take a vacation in the South, but that's... I'm sorry, I'm from upstate New York.
I object.
Amos.
So, to follow up on the minister's comments, more than anything, in terms of self-definition, I happen to be the only child of 2 Holocaust survivors. Both of my parents are Holocaust survivors. They're both deceased, but are Holocaust survivors from Hungary, each with a more horrible story than the other. And there's no doubt that much of my work in the Netherlands is absolutely driven by the fact that I was raised by these two Holocaust survivors. So when I think about social media, for me, it's all about facts. And I'm not telling you anything you all don't know. We are in many ways in the age of Holocaust denial. That's the reality. And we're also seeing a very unpleasant spike in anti-Semitism, whether in Europe or in the United States. And you call it, John Stuart Mills called it the marketplace of ideas. You call it the flea market of ideas. The problem with the flea market of ideas, and I think that's a brilliant phrase, is once it's out there, you can't bring it back. And with all due respect to Facebook, Twitter, and whatever the Google, Schmoogle, whatever they all are, they're all out there. And as the minister knows, and after I wrote the book, I got very unpleasant and very specific death threats, all predicated on the fact that I'm writing about the Holocaust. You would think that we'd be beyond that. As I told you, my late mother could not wrap her mind around the fact that Holocaust denial is a part of our society. And if that sounds a little bit exaggerated, it's not. In many ways, when I talk to you about militant democracy, Constitution is not a suicide pact, and Goebbels, I don't want to say that it's here we are all over again, but history is cyclical, and the role of social media, if we don't wake up and understand its extraordinary power, then we are going to get slapped in the face, boom, boom, by it. Again, before I turn it over to you, we've talked about this. There's no doubt the fact that I was raised by these two Holocaust survivors absolutely drives everything I do. We've talked about that.
Yeah, the question of what social media obligations are, I think, is a really difficult one, and it's one that Congress has been struggling with, the social media providers have been struggling with. I would love if we took the approach less of trying to fix the problem from the supply side, because it's so difficult, and more trying to fix the problem from the demand side. One of the arguments that we made in the Russia report was we need more money for civics education in middle schools, because that's when kids start to develop this sense of asking questions, of thinking analytically. Why is this person saying what they're saying? Do they have an agenda? Is this a fact? Is this an opinion? If it's an opinion, what is that opinion bolstered by? You gotta be able to think through these questions. I resisted Twitter for a very long time. Working in the intelligence community, you don't really do a lot of social media. But when I joined CSIS, my bosses said, you need a Twitter account. It's like, oh, okay, I'll get a Twitter account. So I got one, and I discovered very quickly how easy it is. Just, you sit there and you sort of flip and you read and you flip and you read, and things are moving by you so quickly that you don't pause to think to yourself, wait a minute, who was that guy? And was that actually right? And trying to train yourself to think that way, I think, starts at a very young age and is critically important to teach in a proactive, constructive way in school. I would also say that it would be great if the world could get to a place where we see things that pop up on social media, just like you would see the National Enquirer and the tabloids in the checkout aisles at grocery stores. I'm not sure if our European colleagues in the audience have that, but here in America, right, when you're standing in line at the grocery store, there are all these tabloids, Bat Boy discovered in Ohio, whatever. And people kind of see the National Enquirer banner, and they see the tabloid banner, and they put that in context. Like, oh, this is entertainment. This is not fact. And that's where we need to get with things that are spread on social media as well. I had a lot of very difficult conversations with heads of social media companies back in 2017, where they were optimistic and wide-eyed, and we are a force for good in the world, and we're helping people share, and we're helping people find their communities. And I've worked in national security for a long time. I worked in the intelligence community, so that kind of by definition makes me a bit of a cynic. And having the conversation with them of, yes, but some of those people are bad people trying to do bad things, and you need to wrap your head around the idea that they are going to use your platform for ill. The last thing that I'll say about that is if you haven't read Barbara Walters' book on how civil wars start, I strongly recommend it. It looks at America and also the rest of the world from the perspective of somebody who has reported on global conflict and then trying to apply some of those academic perspectives back to the US and back to our friends and allies. And it's eye-opening. I'm not going to say that I'm scared by it, but it is eye-opening, and I think it really drives home the responsibility that we all have to not tolerate intolerance, and also to protect these democratic freedoms and recognize them as fragile, as not a given, and as something that we all have to work for every day.
Since I grew up in upstate New York, let me say I have some sympathy for these people. I mean, their lives were destroyed by the 2000 agreement with the WTO. They have a sense that they're being ignored. The government, as the arbiter of the social system, does not deliver for them. So I have some sympathy. And I think that's one of the issues that I've been wrestling with is, what are the roots of populism this time? I know what it was in 1900, too bad. And there's this question that you hear, democracy has to deliver. Maybe this leads back to the politicians. Democracy has to deliver for people to want to believe in it. And that might be the first step in a question, what do we have to do to rebuild the legitimacy of democratic government? It is challenged. I think you made that clear. What would you do?
Well, complicated, complex story, nobody understands what's happening there. So being honest is one of the true steps, but also if you are making laws, policies, you're coming up with stuff, again, this should be normal, but I think in way too many, also maybe in the States, we forget for whom am I doing this for? And what is the effect? Does this really work like this? And if not, am I flexible enough to say, okay, this is not the purpose of, this was not the direction I wanted to go to. How can I protect individuals? In the Netherlands, we have seen major mistakes with these steps. So these are very important things for me to have an eye on, to learn from those mistakes, and also make sure that you always go back to the people. You know, I'm in politics, so every election I will go out and I will ask you for your vote. It would be very weird if you saw me back in 4 years and I would say, thank you for your vote 4 years ago, can I have it again, please? And I think that's lazy, being a lazy politician, and I think that also happens too often. I need to come back to you every time, whether via media, social media, in newspapers, face-to-face, to explain to you what am I doing with your vote. And if you're not happy with that, I would love to explain to you why I'm doing it, why I think it's good, but even way, way more important to hear from you what you're experiencing and what can I do for you. So these, I know these sound like very simple things in life, but I think that way too often politicians forget these. And the moment we are sitting in a chair, you might think, okay, now I'm in the chair. So you will know what I've done, which is, of course, with all due respect, bullshit. It should be the other way around. You are there for the people, so make sure that you don't forget that connection and don't just disregard people and think, you don't get me, you don't get how good my policy is, so I will ignore you.
But I get you.
Yeah, you get me. But these, listening to people, that's an active attitude every day and night, and that should be the way for every politician, and I think that's not always the case. And having the space and the room and the possibility to admit mistakes, but also a media and society and a parliament that would also accept that conversation as some basic steps. There's way much to say about it, but maybe as the basic.
For me, as the minister knows, much of my academic research today focuses on the role of enablers and bystanders, particularly in the context of sexual assaults, but you can absolutely take that to a much broader conversation. I would suggest that here we are in 2022, whether wearing my Israeli hat, no hair, but wearing my Israeli hat or my American hat, albeit still no hair. In both societies, we are confronted by genuine internal threats, also in the Netherlands. And the question is, are you going to be a bystander enabler, or are you going to go do something? It's really simple. I mean, this is black-white. And when I trace and track enablers and bystanders in sexual assaults, it's pretty clear to me that sexual assaults happen because of enablers and bystanders. And the same thing with the threat to democracy. We can sit here and say, oh, woe is me, or we can truly become engaged. And I love what you said about your middle school children. As an educator, it all begins with education. And we can take a passive route and go, oh gosh, Or we can, pardon my English, we can go out there and kick some serious ass. And I am firmly of the belief at the age of 65, as I look around, I'm clearly the oldest person in this room. I say we have no choice. There is no choice. And if we don't go out there and engage, there'll be good days, there'll be bad days. You may lose an election. The side you want may lose an election. You know, it happens. There is no doubt that as, you know, look at the young people, whether here in the room or out there in the Zoom world, there is no plan B. There really is no plan B. And you know, whether it's passivity kills or what Einstein said about the silence of complicity and all that, that's where we are. And I really see no alternative whatsoever. And I think that what the minister is articulating here about being passionate, going out there, being engaged, being involved, or you can sit and watch your favorite NFL team win or lose, and that really doesn't matter come Monday morning. You got to go out there and be engaged. And that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think directing that energy appropriately is something that I see youth struggle with, but there are so many things that you can do. You know, run for office, volunteer for a candidate, advocate for legislation that you're passionate about. A very simple thing that you can do is learn how to actually evaluate the performance of your elected officials. I worked on Capitol Hill for a long time, and you know, we talk about show ponies and workhorses. There are people who are really good at going out and talking about themselves on social media or in the press, and there are people who actually get work done. And it's very difficult as a constituent of those people to know the difference. You've got to work to actually learn what your elected representative is doing and to get through the sheen of the media appearances. I think one thing that I would change if I had the magic wand is to reassert this concept of true leadership, and that leadership is about something more than you. Leadership is not winning. Leadership is trying to do the hard thing when nobody's looking, and to do the thing that works for a goal that's larger than yourself. And I think too often, you know, people who are in positions of power are so concerned about the way it looks as opposed to what actually happened. And that's part of what you're talking about, this question of, you know, accountability and if you admit you're wrong. Everybody makes mistakes every day, including elected officials and cabinet officials. And having the courage to say, well, we screwed that up, and this is what we're doing to fix it, and this is what we learned from it, I think is something that, you know, the public needs to get more used to accepting and not use it as a cudgel to just bludgeon the other person. I'm going to say something provocative to close this out here, which is that I think meanwhile, while we get to that point, we actually need less transparency in government. Politicians need the opportunity to ask hard questions behind closed doors. They need the opportunity to make compromises, not in front of a camera where their opponent's going to use that against them in the next election. I worked on the Senate Intelligence Committee, which had the honor and privilege of dealing with some of the nation's most secrets. And as a result, a lot of our conversations were behind closed doors and not on camera. And to a person, every senator on that committee would say it was their favorite committee because there was so much collaboration across the aisle. There was so much agreement in places, and then where there was disagreement, there was an honest and upfront debate about those disagreements because they knew they could ask honest, difficult questions without somebody recording it and then using it against them the next day. So someday I will set aside time to write an article called The False Promise of Transparency and talk about what transparency really should be and what its role is in a democracy. But right now, I think we need to take a step back and evaluate actual performance as opposed to how good somebody looks in a campaign commercial.
So if we have time, spoken like a true graduate of SSCI. So if we have time, we'll come back to the transparency issues, but we got a few questions from the audience. Let me start with one that's a bit of a tar baby. I mentioned in the beginning that I've spoken to 2 out of the 3 big social media networks. That's a hint. How does Musk's recent announcement on censorship and Twitter affect the prospects for democracy? Anyone want to touch that one?
Wow.
If not, we can go to the next question.
You know what, when my students ask a great question, I say that's a great question, which means I have no idea what the answer is.
Yep.
Well, let's see if it works out. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'll say a little bit about that. So Elon Musk and his personal views aside, I think that it is interesting that what we have talked about with Twitter and transparency and what is a credible source and what is not a credible source, like the shred of that existed on Twitter, the little blue check, is now gone in its own way. And then the recent announcement about no longer taking down COVID mis and disinformation, I hope that that is a shove to the viewing public to think about this as the National Enquirer. Like, you have no idea whether this is true or false. It is, at best, sort of a jumping off point for you to go learn things from credible sources. Then you just have to learn what the credible sources actually are. This is someday, your colleagues, 30 years from now, are going to look back on the collapse of Twitter as a great social experiment. And there are going to be all kinds of lessons learned.
Can I add to 30 seconds?
Sure. And then we have 2 more.
30 seconds. There's a danger in shutting down any of these platforms because those who read those platforms will simply go either create their own platform, which will be harder to track. And as much as I find them to be despicable, there's a real potential unintended consequence in terms of you deny them this platform and they go on to a different platform, and that's a problem. And in that way, in terms of the marketplace or what you call it, the flea market ideas, with all the awfulness of it, one needs to think long and hard about, quote unquote, banning it or banning users. It's complicated. 30 seconds.
This might be more for Dilan, but everyone's free to pitch in. Europe, I'm going to paraphrase the question a little bit. So Europe, Western Europe, was often regarded as kind of the workers' paradise. You have retirement and social security and education and healthcare. Why is there populism there in societies that, from an American perspective, they should weep with joy?
It's a PhD course.
I agree, no.
Okay, so next question.
Well, that was quick.
No, I'll take that back. Of course, people have their issues, such in every country, every continent. I think that if you, for example, look at the past few years, of course, the pandemic hit us hard. Thankfully, many companies survived with help from the government on their own in very impressive ways. But it was also very, very heavy. I think we saw it in the globe everywhere, and also in the Netherlands and everywhere in Europe, that the isolation, loneliness, what people experience was really, really, really tough. And then I think that everybody, at least, we thought, okay, now we can go back to normal, freedom is back. And it was, before the pandemic, it was going really well economically in a country such as the Netherlands. And then we saw a few doors ahead, one of our neighbors being brutally attacked by Russia and the war in Ukraine. And the effect of that, again, on the whole society, when you see the prices are rising, it's become more difficult, and you can name it. So that's very, very difficult. The thing for me is, and populism, that I think that's part of our history, and it will always be there. But the thing is, what we mentioned earlier, if it grows, and if we allow it to grow, and that's you allow it by not telling the stories, by not fighting for something. For me, for example, I was in Parliament for 5 years. And I saw this was way before Corona, and I saw this happening, and I saw parties coming into Parliament with, for me, radical ideas. But it's democracy, everybody can get a vote, and you can go in politics. And I was like, I'm going to ignore these voices. I'm not going to give them attention. I'm going to focus on other voices, because if I give it attention, it will grow, it will be bigger, it will have more podium, and I don't want that. So if we just ignore it, it will disappear. But the opposite happens. It doesn't disappear. It grows, because I am not giving a response, I'm not giving an answer, I'm not giving another story. I'm just letting it be there. So it will grow, and it will grow, and it will become a fact. It's, of course. So that was a mistake, I think. We did that in the Netherlands. And now we see in our parliament parties who are, saying that ministers went to spy schools, so that the world is being governed by lizards, and that Corona is not such a thing, that Putin is the great leader. And this is happening. And now we are looking for ways to address this. How do you do that? Because that's not easy. This is not facts against facts, and we have a difference of opinion, and we will have a debate and then we will find a solution. No, it doesn't work like that. And you see, so for me, it's become clear that we don't know how to handle this. We don't know. So in Dutch history, it had never happened before, but the whole minister's crew, the cabinet, we were in a debate, and again, these voices came up, and we stood up and we walked out. That never happened before during a debate in a democracy such as the Netherlands. It's not something I'm proud of. I hope it will never happen again, but we didn't know anything else to do anymore. So this is, we'll have to find ways to address this, and I think that's the most important thing, and this can happen everywhere. And you're right, we have a good social system, but if we are not there fighting for our system and for our democracy, if we don't tell people and act like something is at stake, then it will be gone, and that's what's happening now.
I gotta say, those giant lizards, they're doing a terrible job.
I was going to add that there's a great movie from the 1960s about lizards ruling the earth, and it's consistently voted one of the worst horror movies of all times. But in any case.
Maybe we can have a showing the next time I'm here.
It's easy. It's very easy for somebody to stand up and make gigantic promises of all the things they're going to give you and all of the problems of yours they're going to fix. It's very hard to follow through. And then when they don't follow through, it's very easy to blame the other side for the fact that they didn't follow through. And this is why it's so important to be a smart consumer of the promises. How are you going to do that? It's not possible.
One of the difficulties or the challenges in terms of the blame game, not to go back to Goebbels, but Goebbels is important in this conversation. Because if you think historically, you think Treaty of Versailles and what the blame game led to, it led to the Holocaust. And when I listen to the minister, I'm allowed to say this, we've spent a lot of time, right, okay. This real question, there's a challenge because we all believe in democracy, right? There's also a need for vigilance. And there is an enormous tension between, on the one hand, democratic values, which we obviously all believe in. On the other hand, vigilance, because vigilance sounds scary. It sounds like a vigilant. And vigilant has negative connotations, but to be vigilant in the name of protecting democracy is not a negative. It's actually, it's a must. How to market that is, I look at the minister because she's a politician and highly skilled politician, highly articulate politician. There's a line you have to walk between being vigilant, right? On the other hand, you want to articulate and allow for freedom of expression, but there is somewhere that thin line that if you cross it, you've gone one step too far.
Maybe an open-ended question to conclude, and we didn't get to talk specifically about the drug problem in the Netherlands, but it points to this issue, which is that you want to give people freedom. Pardon me, let me rephrase that. People want freedom, and they've developed governments that give it to them, right? But we know that there can be excess. So what's the path forward? Do we just have a tough slog ahead of us? Is there something, what's the path forward for addressing this?
For me, the most important thing is that we together, so that's not for politicians, academia, journalists, that's the whole society together, we will be aware of what's at stake. For me, that's the most important thing. And as I told in my keynote just now, in a society such as the Netherlands, because it's, we think that there's always going to be freedom, which is something to be very proud of, that we have generations and after generations who truly believe that. We fought for that. That's great. You have to nurture and cherish that. But it also means that you are not aware of the dangers. You are not looking out for the dangers, so you are not standing up. And that standing up, being an active defender of democracy, being resilient, that is something that no politician can do by themselves, no journalist, no academia. This is a society thing. And for me, that's what's so important. We have to be aware of what's at stake and also know that the only way to protect it, so that's our way of living, is by standing up. And standing up can be all those small steps. That can be online when you're on Twitter and you see that a journalist is being attacked, that you say something, that you do something. Because I know as a politician how lonely it can get if you're online and you're being attacked and everybody else is silent because they know if I say something, they will come after me, which can be very lonely. And this, you can translate to every level in life, but the only way to show that we are with more, that we have a story, and I think that what's at stake is more valuable to us than to those people who are trying to grab it from us. So then you have to fight for it, and fight, that's of course with debate, online, let yourself heard, stand up for something, don't allow others to undermine our institutions, the freedom of speech, academia, the police. There's so much to say about this, but the only way to protect it is to do it together.
30 seconds. The minister.
Was that too long?
No, I
Do you
was
mean
too good.
that?
No, not at all. You're the minister.
Sorry.
You mentioned in your keynote the whole notion of the sacred veil. For me, when I wrote the sacred veil, it meant that we were protecting religion because we didn't want to engage with religion. We were uncomfortable. It has to be stripped. Then there are two words. One is to hold people accountable for their actions. And there's an absolute lack of accountability, and we need to hold people accountable. And the other, I go to you. There's an absolute, sitting where we are at CSIS, there's a need to educate the public about the dangers that society is facing. And absent that education and absent the accountability which the minister is talking about, ain't nothing going to change. Those three thoughts, sacred veil, accountability, and education, this is for me the primary motivation. And thank you for having me, and thank you for asking me to be here.
It's wonderfully concise. For me, I think that the key is communicating the balance of freedom and responsibility. These two go hand in hand. You have the freedom to live your life as you want to live your life. You also have the responsibility to act as a positive member of a society. We all agree in this country to DWI laws. You're not allowed to drive drunk. And that's because you have the freedom to go out and get drunk if you want, but you do not have the freedom to go imperil the lives of other people on the roadways. We all agree to a set of rules that govern society, and that's to keep everyone safe and to keep everyone's freedoms. If you want to buy a huge piece of land out west and drive drunk on it all day long, you are welcome to do that. But please don't drive next to me and my children on the highway. These things are in balance. Same way, you have the right to say whatever you want to. I will stand up and protect your right to free speech to the utmost of my capabilities. I will also disagree with you when you say something I disagree with. I am not required to agree with your point of view. I am required to let you have one. And I think that kind of gets lost in this conversation about, ultimate freedoms and people getting worried about being insulted. And finally, changing your mind is not a sign of weakness. That, I think, is very difficult for, in this particular moment of history, people to acknowledge. If you think about a topic and you get new information about a topic and then you change your mind about that topic, that's courage, that's strength, that's growth. That's something that we all should embrace. We should celebrate it when somebody in public life changes their mind.
So we've barely touched the surface. This is a complex issue, and I think one that will preoccupy democracies for years to come. One of the things I've been looking at since there have been previous episodes is how did they end, right? Because the bus almost always rights itself, right? It wobbles a lot. But one of the things I've learned, and this echoes the minister's point, is that it doesn't happen automatically. People have to push back. So that's, I think, one of the most important points you made today, and I thank you for being here at CSIS. Please join me in thanking the minister and the panel.